He felt gravity rip him backward against cold concrete, until a hand pulled him from the brink. Charles Blackwood gripped the metal handrail as he navigated the subway station stairs with a methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam. His knees protested each step, phantom pain lancing through his left leg, where shrapnel still nestled against bone. The Veterans Affairs appointment had gone poorly. Another delay, another form, another "we'll call you." The afternoon light slanted through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across worn steps that had seen a million hurried feet. Behind him, raucous laughter erupted. Charles didn't turn, had learned decades ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. 3 voices, young, slurred with midday drinking, the kind of voices that made the hair on his neck stand up, that triggered the hypervigilance he could never quite shake. Keep moving. Don't engage. Just get home to Margaret's photo and the silence. His weathered fingers tightened on the rail, knuckles whitening beneath liver-spotted skin. Hey, Grandpa, what's the rush? The voice was razor-sharp with mockery cutting through the station's ambient noise. Charles kept his eyes forward, his pace steady. His service medals sat heavy in his pocket, small consolations he'd planned to show the VA representative, proof of sacrifice they always seemed to question. The footsteps behind him quickened, stumbling, eager. The smell of cheap beer and expensive cologne wafted forward. Before we continue with the story, be sure to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. We love learning about our viewers. Now let's get back to the story. I'm talking to you, old man. The voice was closer now, insistent, entitled. Charles felt the presence at his back too close, invading the perimeter of safety he'd learned to maintain in jungles and crowded cities alike. He shifted slightly, making room, a silent plea to be left alone. His throat tightened, the old panic rising. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, somehow both too bright and not bright enough to chase away the shadows. The shove came without warning, hard palms against his shoulder blades, fingers digging into his worn jacket. Charles felt himself tilting backward, his center of gravity betraying him, the railing slipping from his grasp. Not like this, he thought as the world tilted. Not after surviving everything else. His arms windmilled, grasping at empty air. Behind him, laughter erupted, vicious and uncaring, the sound of youth that had never known consequence. He struck the first step with his hip, a sharp crack that reverberated through aged bones. The second impact caught his elbow, skin tearing against concrete. Charles tumbled, a wounded bird in free fall, each bounce driving air from lungs that had once carried him through midnight marches. His glasses flew off, the world blurring into smears of color and shadow. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, where he'd bitten his tongue. The tumble seemed endless, each impact a new geography of pain across a body already mapped with old injuries. His duffel bag burst open, spilling pill bottles and paperwork, the evidence of his endless battle with bureaucracy now scattered like battlefield debris. Through the roaring in his ears he heard gasps from other commuters, the shuffling of feet as they moved away rather than toward. Just like coming home the first time, he thought bitterly. Everyone seeing but nobody wanting to see. Charles came to rest at the bottom of the staircase, sprawled across cold tile. Above him, the teenage boys high-fived, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. That's what happens when you move too slow, dinosaur. One called down, voice slurred but piercing. Pain radiated from every point of impact, but worse was the humiliation burning through him, hotter than any wound. His pants had torn at the knee, revealing the surgical scar from his last operation, a roadmap of medical attempts to piece him back together. He tried to push himself up, palms slipping in a smear of his own blood. The station spun around him, faces blurring as commuters glanced, then quickly away, uncomfortable with this collision of cruelty and age. His dog tags had slipped from his shirt, dangling like an accusation. Blackwood, Charles E. 38157629. O positive. The tags that had once identified him from medics now simply marked him as other, a relic from a war most preferred to forget. Get up, soldier, he commanded himself, but his body refused to comply, betraying him just as his country had so many times before. And then, cutting through the haze of pain and shame, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. not pushing this time, but steadying. "Don't move, sir," a voice said, low and urgent. "I've got you now." Charles blinked up at the blurry figure kneeling beside him, unable to make out features without his glasses, but sensing something he hadn't felt in years, the presence of someone who wasn't looking away. The pain in his hip flared white-hot as he tried to shift, and the world dimmed at the edges, darkness creeping in as consciousness began to slip away from him like water through cupped hands. Charles fought to stay conscious, the fluorescent lights overhead pulsing in time with the throbbing in his temple. Blood trickled warm and insistent from a gash above his right eyebrow, painting his vision crimson. The hand on his shoulder remained firm, an anchor in the storm of pain and disorientation. "Someone call an ambulance," the voice above him commanded, authority ringing through the cavernous station. Footsteps scattered like startled birds, some moving closer, others fleeing the scene of uncomfortable reality. "Those punks," Charles whispered, his voice scraping against a throat suddenly dry as Afghan dust. "They're getting away." He could hear their laughter receding up the stairs, the sound of impunity that had haunted him since coming home with nightmares no one wanted to hear about. Always the same story, the ones who caused the damage walk away clean. The stranger's hand moved to support his head, keeping it from resting on the cold, grimy tile. "My name is Marcus," the voice said, closer now. "I'm an off-duty EMT. Try not to move." A face came into focus as Marcus gently slid Charles's glasses back onto his face, dark eyes filled with competent concern, skin the color of burnished copper, lines of experience etched around his mouth. Not young, but not old either, perhaps 50. Charles could see now that Marcus wore hospital scrubs beneath an unzipped jacket, an ID badge still clipped to his pocket. "Can you tell me your name, sir?" "Charles Blackwood. Sergeant, retired." The words came automatically, the introduction he'd given 1,000 times to indifferent government employees. 73 years old, and apparently still not invisible enough. He tried to laugh, but it emerged as a pained wheeze. Marcus's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulse points, gently probing for injuries, all while keeping his body positioned to block curious onlookers' views. Charles felt a rush of gratitude for this small dignity. The station manager appeared above them, radio squawking in hand, face carefully arranged in professional concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ambulance is 8 minutes out." Was he drinking? Did he fall on his own? The questions were directed at Marcus, as if Charles had suddenly lost the ability to speak for himself along with his balance. Just like the VA office, he thought bitterly. "Talk about me like I'm not even here." He was pushed, Marcus stated flatly, not looking up from his assessment, by 3 teenagers. They went up the north exit. "If you hurry, your security cameras might catch them." His tone left no room for debate, a shield of certainty protecting Charles from the implicit accusation. "And I'll need a first aid kit now, not when you get around to it." The manager blinked, then hurried away, suddenly efficient, when faced with Marcus's quiet authority. A small crowd had gathered now, the inevitable collection of smartphone documentarians and reluctant witnesses. Charles felt their eyes like physical touch, invasive and judging. His military ID and VA paperwork lay scattered across the floor, his life reduced to laminated cards and denial letters now soaking up blood and grime. "My things," he murmured, trying again to rise. The pain in his hip flared from ember to inferno, drawing a gasp that tasted of copper and defeat. "Stay still," Marcus insisted, one hand gently restraining while the other gathered the scattered documents. "Your hip might be fractured." He carefully tucked the paperwork and ID back into Charles's torn duffel bag, pausing briefly at the sight of the Purple Heart citation before folding it with reverence and sliding it into a side pocket. "Vietnam?" he asked quietly, eyes meeting Charles's with something the older man hadn't seen in decades, recognition without pity. "2 tours. Came home in '72 to people who either called me baby killer or looked right through me." Charles wasn't sure why he was telling this stranger things he rarely discussed with anyone. Perhaps it was the concussion, or perhaps it was the way Marcus listened, truly listened, his hands continuing their careful assessment while his eyes remained engaged. "Looks like not much has changed in 50 years. A young woman stepped forward from the gathered crowd, phone clutched in her hand. I got them on video, she said, her voice wavering between determination and uncertainty. The boys who pushed him. I was behind them on the stairs. I recorded it after they started harassing him. She held the phone out to Marcus, who nodded gratefully. I could send it to you, or to the police. This isn't right. He could have been killed. Charles felt something shift in his chest, a hairline crack in the armor of bitterness he'd built over decades. Someone saw. Someone acted. The station manager returned with a meager first aid kit, which Marcus opened with practiced hands. The police are on their way too, the manager added, now hovering with the nervous energy of someone worried about liability. Marcus ignored him, focusing entirely on applying pressure to Charles's head wound, with surprising gentleness for such large hands. The wail of approaching sirens filtered down into the station, and Charles felt the fight leaving his body as exhaustion and pain claimed their territory. His consciousness began to fade again, but before darkness took him completely, he heard Marcus speaking to someone on the phone, his voice low but intense. "Listen, Diane, I know you're on deadline, but this is important. I just witnessed something at the Westview station that people need to hear about. An elderly veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, pushed down a flight of stairs by teenagers for sport. No, this isn't just another sad story. This is about who we've become when we let this happen in broad daylight. Because I'm sitting here with his blood on my hands, and tomorrow it could be someone else's father or grandfather. You owe me one, and I'm calling it in now." The paramedics worked with swift efficiency, strapping Charles to a backboard despite his mumbled protests. The fluorescent lights of the ambulance interior pulsed in rhythm, with the pain radiating from his hip. "I can't afford this," he whispered, the admission burning his pride more than his injuries burned his flesh. "No insurance outside the VA." The words felt like surrender, a white flag raised after decades of silent struggle. The female paramedic exchanged glances with her partner, then gently patted Charles's hand. "Let's worry about getting you fixed up first, sir," she said, sliding an IV needle into his paper-thin skin with practiced ease. "Your friend Marcus is following behind us. He seems like the type who knows how to navigate systems." The medication flowed cold into Charles's veins, dulling the jagged edges of pain and loosening the tight bands of anxiety around his chest. Through the ambulance's rear windows he could see Marcus's sedan trailing them, a guardian presence that made no logical sense but somehow felt like the most natural thing in the world. The emergency room was a blur of curtains and questions, of hands that prodded and machines that beeped. X-rays confirmed what Charles had already known, a fractured hip that would require surgery, along with 3 broken ribs and a concussion. Each diagnosis added another zero to a bill he couldn't possibly pay, another weight to shoulders already bowed by decades of carrying invisible burdens. When the doctor stepped away to arrange admission, Charles closed his eyes against the harsh hospital lights. This is how it ends then. Not with a bullet or a bang, but with bankruptcy and broken bones. "Mr. Blackwood?" The voice pulled him from the edge of despair. Marcus stood beside his gurney, still in his scrubs, but now with a press badge clipped alongside his hospital ID. "The police have the video of your assault. They've identified the teenagers from their school IDs in the footage." He pulled a chair closer, metal legs scraping against linoleum. "But that's not why I'm here. I called a friend at the Tribune. She's a reporter who specializes in veterans issues. Would it be all right if she interviewed you? People need to hear about this." Charles stared at the ceiling, counting water stains to avoid meeting Marcus's gaze. What's the point? Another sad story about an old man that people will scroll past between coffee ads and celebrity gossip. The bitterness in his voice surprised even him, decades of disappointment distilled into a single sentence. "No one cared when we came home broken. No one cared when the system failed us at every turn. Why would they care now?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because I care. Because that young woman who recorded the video cares. Because my friend Diane, who's waiting outside, cares enough to push your story above the fold." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "My father was in Vietnam too, 101st Airborne. He came home changed, and no one helped him find his way back. He died alone while I was deployed, as a combat medic in Iraq. I couldn't help him, but maybe I can help you." The admission hung in the air between them, a bridge formed of shared understanding. Charles felt tears burning behind his eyes for the first time in years. "I'm not a charity case," he said finally, the words lacking conviction. "I'm just an old soldier who survived when better men didn't." His fingers twisted in the thin hospital blanket, seeking an anchor in the sterile room. "This isn't charity," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "This is community. This is recognizing that what happened to you isn't just about you, it's about who we are as a society when we let our elders, our veterans, be treated this way." He gestured toward the door. "Diane won't sensationalize your story or turn you into a victim. She'll use it to show people what happens when we look away instead of stepping up." Charles considered the man before him, not a savior or a saint, just someone who had refused to walk past. The kind of person he himself had been, once, before disappointment calcified into resignation. With a slight nod, he signaled his consent. "All right. But no pictures of me in this damn hospital gown." The joke felt rusty on his tongue, but Marcus's answering smile was genuine, a small victory in a day of defeats. The interview was surprisingly gentle, Diane asking questions that probed beneath the surface without reopening old wounds. She recorded his military history, his struggles with the VA system, the humiliation of being attacked simply for being old and in the way. When she asked why he'd been at the station that day, Charles found himself sharing more than he'd intended: the denied claim for pain management, the anniversary of his wife Margaret's death, the empty apartment waiting for him with its walls of silent photographs. "We'll run this tomorrow," Diane promised, as she packed away her recorder. Front page, with context about veteran care and elder abuse. "The police have already charged the teenagers, but this story is bigger than one incident." She squeezed his hand before leaving, her eyes fierce with purpose. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Blackwood, both then and now. Telling your truth is another kind of service." After she left, Charles drifted in and out of consciousness, pain medication blurring the edges of reality. He was vaguely aware of Marcus speaking with doctors, of forms being signed and arrangements being made. "Don't worry about the bills," Marcus had said at some point, though Charles couldn't be sure if it was real or medication-induced dreaming. "We're going to figure this out together." The next evening, propped up in his hospital bed waiting for surgery, scheduled for the following morning, Charles noticed a television mounted in the corner of his room. The evening news played quietly, and he fumbled for the remote to increase the volume when he saw Diane's familiar face on the screen. "Tonight, a story that should shame us all," the anchor was saying. A 73-year-old Vietnam veteran, decorated with the Purple Heart, was viciously attacked in a subway station yesterday. Our own Diane Reynolds has the exclusive. The screen filled with the shaky cell phone footage, showing Charles on the stairs, the teenagers behind him, the sudden shove. His stomach clenched at seeing himself tumble down the concrete steps, at hearing the laughter that followed his fall. But then the camera captured something he hadn't seen: how Marcus had rushed from the bottom of the stairs, dropping his duffel bag to kneel beside him, while others stood frozen. How the young woman recording had shouted at the teenagers, her voice shaking but determined. How an elderly woman had picked up his scattered medications, carefully collecting each pill bottle, while tears streamed down her lined face. Charles watched, transfixed, as Diane narrated over his military photos, young Charles in uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, standing tall beside comrades long since gone. "This is not just about one act of cruelty," Diane's voice continued over the images. "This is about how we treat those who served, those who age, those who need our protection rather than our scorn." The camera cut to Marcus, composed and articulate, as he explained the systemic failures that had left veterans like Charles vulnerable. "The real question," Marcus concluded, looking directly into the camera, "is who will we be tomorrow? The ones who push, the ones who walk past, or the ones who stop to help?" As the segment ended, Charles's phone, silent for months except for robocalls, began to buzz on the bedside table. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Just saw you on the news. This is James from the VA office. I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm escalating your case personally first thing tomorrow." Before Charles could process this, another message appeared, then another and another. his phone lighting up with notifications like a Christmas tree. Former comrades, neighbors he barely knew, strangers touched by his story, all reaching out with words of support, offers of help, expressions of outrage on his behalf. Charles felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for decades. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers onto the blanket as tears finally broke free, running unchecked down weathered cheeks. For the first time since coming home from a distant jungle, he didn't feel invisible. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Dawn broke over the hospital window, painting the sterile room in hues of gold and promise. Charles awoke from post-surgery sleep to find Marcus dozing in the visitor's chair, head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, still wearing yesterday's scrubs. On the bedside table, flowers crowded alongside cards and small packages, evidence of strangers' concern that had materialized overnight like rain in a drought. The hip replacement surgery had gone well, the doctor had told him before the anesthesia pulled him under. 6 weeks of recovery, then physical therapy, all somehow being handled through a veterans emergency fund that Marcus had contacted. "You're awake," Marcus said, straightening and rubbing his neck. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but he smiled with genuine warmth. "How's the pain?" He poured water from a plastic pitcher, helping Charles navigate the straw to parched lips. The simple act of kindness, one human tending to another's basic needs, brought a lump to Charles's throat that had nothing to do with surgical trauma. "Manageable," Charles replied, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "You didn't have to stay." The words were inadequate, failing to capture the depth of his gratitude, his bewilderment at this unexpected alliance. Why would this man, this stranger, give so much to someone he never knew before yesterday? The question had circled his mind during lucid moments between medication cycles, a puzzle his cynical heart couldn't quite solve. Marcus shrugged, the gesture dismissive, but not unkind. "My shift ended at midnight. Seemed easier to crash here than go home only to come back." He nodded toward the window, where morning light strengthened by the minute. "Besides, I didn't want you to wake up alone to all this. It's been quite a night." He gestured toward Charles's phone, which sat silent now, but had buzzed continuously until hospital quiet hours. "Your story struck a nerve. The station security footage was released, and it's everywhere now." Charles followed Marcus's gaze to the muted television, where his own face appeared on the morning news, not the broken figure at the bottom of the stairs, but a dignified military portrait from 50 years ago, young eyes staring confidently into a future that would prove far more challenging than he had imagined. The chyron scrolling beneath read, "Community rallies around assaulted veteran. Donations pour in." The reality of public attention made him deeply uncomfortable, a lifetime of stoic privacy rebelling against sudden visibility. "I never wanted to be anyone's cause," Charles murmured, adjusting the thin hospital blanket with fingers still bruised from his fall. The movement sent pain radiating from his surgical site, a sharp reminder of how quickly life could change course. "I just wanted to be treated with basic dignity. To not have to fight for every scrap of care I was promised." The admission felt like surrender and defiance simultaneously, a truth he'd held close for decades finally spoken aloud. A knock at the door interrupted before Marcus could respond. A hospital administrator entered, followed by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the Veterans Affairs Regional Director. "Mr. Blackwood, I want to personally apologize for your experience with our office," the director began, his practiced sincerity almost convincing. "We've reviewed your case overnight and approved all pending claims, backdated to your original filing." He placed a business card on the bedside table, nestled among the flowers like a peace offering. "My direct line. Any issues going forward, you call me directly." After they left, Marcus's expression was carefully neutral. Funny how a little public attention suddenly clears bureaucratic roadblocks. The observation carried no judgment, just the weary knowledge of systems that responded to pressure rather than need. He checked his watch and stood, stretching tired muscles. "I need to head home to shower before my shift, but I'll be back this evening. Is there anything you need from your apartment?" The question, so normal, so considerate, nearly undid Charles completely. How long had it been since anyone had asked what he needed? Since Margaret's death 3 years ago, he had existed in a vacuum of self-sufficiency, pride preventing him from admitting how difficult simple tasks had become. "My reading glasses," he said finally, "and the photo by my bed, of my wife." He fumbled with the hospital blanket, embarrassed by his own vulnerability. "The spare key is under the ceramic frog by your door," Marcus finished, smiling at Charles's surprise. "You mentioned it yesterday when they were prepping you for surgery." "Don't worry, I was listening." He patted Charles's shoulder gently. "Rest now. I'll be back before you know it." Alone, Charles drifted between sleep and wakefulness, his thoughts circling between past and present. The nurse, who came to check his vitals, mentioned that the hospital lobby was filling with people dropping off cards and care packages. "You've become quite the local hero," she said, adjusting his IV with practiced hands. "Those boys who pushed you, their parents brought them to apologize, but security turned them away until you're stronger. Said they're ready whenever you are." The idea of facing his attackers stirred complicated emotions, not vindictiveness, but a weary desire for understanding. What makes a young man see an old one as less than human? What could I possibly say to change that? The questions followed him into uneasy dreams, where he alternated between falling down endless stairs and marching through jungle underbrush, always searching for something just beyond reach. He awoke to find his room transformed. Beyond the clinical equipment, every surface now held evidence of community concern. Handmade cards from elementary school classes, gift baskets from local businesses, a handcrafted quilt from a veterans support group. His old service photo had been enlarged and framed, placed where he could see it from his bed, a reminder of the young man still living somewhere inside his aged body. And beside it, retrieved from his apartment as promised, sat Margaret's photograph, her smile eternally patient and kind. Marcus returned as evening shadows lengthened, accompanied by an older woman who introduced herself as his mother. She carried a covered dish that filled the room with the aroma of home-cooked comfort, so different from institutional meals. "My son told me what happened," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she arranged the food on his tray. "My husband, Marcus's father, came home from Vietnam with wounds nobody could see. Nobody helped him then, but we can help you now." As Charles ate his first truly satisfying meal in months, Marcus showed him the online fundraising campaign that had sprung up overnight. $37,000 and counting, he said, turning the screen so Charles could see the comments scrolling beneath the donation bar. "People want to help with your medical bills, with home modifications for your recovery, with whatever you need." He paused, watching Charles's expression carefully. "This doesn't erase what happened, it doesn't fix the system, but it means you're not fighting alone anymore." Charles set down his fork, overwhelmed by generosity he couldn't comprehend and didn't know how to accept. "Why?" he asked simply, the question encompassing everything. Why Marcus had stopped to help, why strangers now cared, why this moment of cruelty had sparked connection when decades of quiet suffering had gone unnoticed. Why now? Why me? Marcus considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe because your story made people face something they try to ignore, that we're all vulnerable, all one bad moment away from needing help. Or maybe because deep down, most people want to be their better selves, and sometimes they just need permission, need someone to show them how." He smiled slightly. "Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe when one person stops to help, it reminds everyone else that they can stop too." A text message alert chimed on Charles's phone, another former serviceman who'd seen the news, someone from his old unit he hadn't spoken to in decades. "We take care of our own," the message read. "Should have been doing it all along." Charles felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of armor he'd worn for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his skin. For 50 years he'd carried the weight of believing he'd been forgotten, abandoned by the country he'd served and the people he'd protected. The truth was both simpler and more complex. He had never been truly forgotten, just temporarily overlooked in a world moving too quickly to notice those falling behind. Later that evening, as hospital sounds faded into night shift quiet, Charles watched Marcus dozing in the visitor's chair, refusing to leave, despite Charles's insistence. The younger man's presence anchored him, a living reminder that bridges could still be built across the chasms of generation, race, and experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: physical therapy, police statements, decisions about what justice might look like for teenage boys who didn't understand the impact of their actions. But for the first time in years, tomorrow also held possibility. Charles reached for Margaret's photograph, tracing her smile with a gentle finger. "You always said I needed to let people in," he whispered to her silent image. "Took me long enough to listen." As pain medication pulled him towards sleep, Charles felt something he had almost forgotten: the quiet certainty that he was not alone, that his story mattered, that the hand that had pulled him from the brink of that staircase had also pulled him back from the edge of isolation where he had lived for too long. It wasn't just about one fall or one helping hand. It was about rediscovering what it meant to be seen, truly seen, in a world that had looked past him for far too long.